Hi, I am Paul Armitage, a partner at Gowling WLG. Technology and data are key parts of our world today. At Gowling WLG, our team of legal professionals can help you take a proactive approach to meeting your legal obligations in the field of cybersecurity and managing a cyber breach if it does happen. Visit our website today to learn how we can help.
Thanks a lot for joining us on BIV Today, the podcast from the Newsroom of Business in Vancouver. I'm Kirk LaPointe, publisher and editor-in-chief. Our subject is a problem that's been complicated by the pandemic, how to keep our information secure and safe from invasion in this emerging era of working from home. What can individuals and businesses do to mitigate risk? That's what we're going to be focusing on in the second part of our podcast today. Derek Manky is Chief of Security Insights and Global Threat Alliances at Fortinet's FortiGuard Labs. David Masson is Director of Enterprise for Darktrace. It's an AI company that specializes in cyber defense. And Paul Armitage is a partner in the Gowling law firm, where he's its head of Vancouver Industry Technology Group. Today, we're going to talk really about how it is that we can protect ourselves, businesses and consumers. We're going to focus on this in our time together. And Paul, let's start with what are the best protections for business at the moment?
Well, it's important to be prepared, to have an incident response plan. So, there's obviously the technical protections that need to be put in place around the firewalls, updating antivirus software, computer updates, and things of that sort. And then, from the sort of the corporate perspective, one of the key elements to have is an actual incident response plan. So, if a breach does occur, your organization is in a position to respond to it. And so, of course, one of the interesting things about the COVID epidemic, with everyone moving to working remotely, their previous incident response plan may need to be revisited because it may have been premised, for example, on everyone being at the office. And the first step of the plan could be to get the head of IT, the chief legal officer, of the case may be, in a boardroom together to discuss what the problem is. Of course, that's not possible anymore. So organizations need to have an incident response plan that will put them in a position to be able to respond, and that's and one that will actually work in this environment. So that's like a sort of a crucial element, so that when a breach does occur, and of course, despite no matter what steps people may have taken to secure their organization, breaches can still occur, that they're in a position to be able to respond to it and identify the breach, address the breach, and then take steps to mitigate the harm and remedial steps to make it hard for the same type of breach to reoccur in the future.
Yeah, David, all that sounds quite expensive.
Potentially, it can be expensive, as we've all said before. It's all about training your staff and then the technology you use. The risk you run in cyber is made up of two facets, really. It's the threat you face and your vulnerability to that threat. For most of us, there's not a damn thing we can do about the threat. There's fat chance of us hiring a bunch of ex-special forces and parachuting them into country X to go and do something about it. It's not going to happen. So what we have to do is we have to focus on our vulnerability to that threat. And that's really the starting point for everybody in this in business. And something we do need to bear in mind, right now, the advantage always seems to lie with the attacker on the offensive side. But if you think about it, it shouldn't be really, because if we have visibility, and it was something that Derek brought up earlier, we should really know what we've got and know absolutely everything about it. Whereas when an attacker lands on your network, they're naive, they've never been there before, they're lost lambs in a world they've never seen before. And we should, if we know our landscape, we should see them when they arrive. But curiously, most organizations simply don't have that visibility. And that's why you hear about things like the Equifax hack, where a huge amount of data walked off the network and nobody saw it.
So is the problem there, David, that some companies don't even know what they have?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. The number of times we've gone into a company and asked them how many devices they've had, and we've ended up finding 25 to 30% more IP-connected devices than they thought they had, including occasionally the business next door. So there you
go. Yeah. Well, yeah, you're next door to an interesting bunch of businesses there. Derek, pick up on that.
Yeah, so a couple of things. So just commenting on what Paul is talking about, specifically with the IR planning, it is important, but that's the end of the process. If you think of the attack life cycle, you really have to have your bases covered from the proactive preventative measures. So to David's point, knowing the enemy, knowing your vulnerabilities, doing everything you can in advance. Nothing is 100%. There's never a silver bullet in our industry. So, but being proactive and trying to mitigate that risk as much as possible goes a long way. To the expensive comment, yes, it can get pricey, but if you look at the risk, it's nowhere near the cost of damages that can occur. I mean, like, if you look at the Ponemon Institute as an example, average cost of a data breach is pegged, and this is in US dollars, but at 3.92 million, I think, last year. We've seen targeted ransom cases, damages happening in the tens of millions of dollars, organizations taking out cyber insurance policies in that tune. So the cost up front is definitely worth the investment. So that's part of it. On the incident response part, knowing the not just a general incident response, but having playbooks developed for specific things. It's more granularity that's also important, i.e. what to do in a ransom attack versus a DOS attack, those sorts of things. And finally, my last comment would be, I think really when it comes to being able to protect against a threat, it's really important. Not everyone has the resources or skill sets to have their own threat experts on site. So being able to work with vendors, MSSPs, managed security service providers, and being able to, we have a lot of technology today. Things that are mundane tasks that humans shouldn't have to do, automation, orchestration, machine learning, AI solutions, those are all viable things to look at.
I mean, I've tried to keep up with the daily doling out of funds from senior levels of government around a variety of things in order to make us safer in all of this. I haven't noticed any government plan to help us keep our data secure in all of this. Does one have to come here, Derek?
To a high level plan? I think, when that comes back to the education. There are frameworks, of course, if you look at things like NIST as an example that have been developed. I think it definitely helps to have reference points, especially in different verticals. Having the channels, areas that organizations can reach out to. In the case specifically going back to a classic threat like ransomware, what to do if you get hit with an attack, who to report that to. That's all definitely very important, because I think a lot of times people just don't know that. Organizations don't know.
Yeah. David, is government the place to get the help in all of this, or does the government have all the same problems that businesses have?
Well, the Canadian government's got a pretty good idea of the scale of the threat that it faces to the Canadian government. That's well known. Speaking as a former member of it, it's outside of government where things are a bit sketchier. It's difficult in Canada to actually say what is the scale of the threat in Canada. Derek's company will have an opinion, another company will have an opinion, we have an opinion, but it's difficult to find out why, because we haven't really got a proper central collection process to actually discover what's happening with all the attacks. Now, I know we've had changes to the law, that we had the Digital Privacy Act a couple of years ago, which said that, if you get hacked, you've got to report it to the Office of the Privacy Commissioner. And that kind of kicked off quite well, but I saw some statistics really recently that shows that about half of those who get hacked actually report the hack at the end of the day. And so we don't really know what the scale of the threat is. And the problem with that is, if you don't know what the scale of the threat actually is, you don't know where to deploy your resources and your budget and your people to do something about it. And you end up with sketchy post-attack remediations rather than a general, as I said before, you can't do much about the threat, but a more general, let's concentrate on our vulnerabilities.
Paul, I think some people would find a bit curious that you're not necessarily compelled to report the attack. What's the legal requirement for businesses in these cases?
Yeah, so as David mentioned, the federal privacy law was amended 2 years ago to create what actually is mandatory breach reporting. And it's sort of two-step reporting. You report two different reports. You report both to the privacy commissioner and to the individuals if that notice to the individuals would help them mitigate the potential harm to them. So I say it's mandatory, but there is nonetheless a test that's involved. And so the test really is there has there been a breach of security safeguard that would lead to what's considered a reasonable prospect of harm. So there could be some analysis there. So for example, you could have a breach, but perhaps the data was fully encrypted and could actually be used in the hands of whoever got their hands on it, or it could have been accessed by a trusted source, that they nonetheless weren't supposed to get it, but you're able to get the data back, right? So there, it is possible to suffer, a security breach, but not trip that legal standard that would trigger the reporting obligation. So at a federal level, we do have mandatory breach reporting, as has been described. In British Columbia, interestingly, our privacy law has not yet been amended to include mandatory breach reporting. But across really all the jurisdictions in Canada, the privacy commissioners have guidelines around breach reporting that read very much like mandatory guidelines. They're legally speaking, they're not actually mandatory, but they nonetheless will create the obligation and the expectation that organizations will treat this serious and report it. And as we mentioned, one of the biggest threats or dangers to any sort of security interest is really a reputational one. And so organizations that don't take these things seriously obviously risk a bigger reputational hit than those that do follow the best practices and do follow the guidelines around reporting.
Yeah, Derek, as a journalist that's always kind of fighting for transparency on this and transparency on that, are these provisions kind of soft still?
Kind of, sorry?
Soft.
Oh, yeah, I think we always need to do better as a whole in the industry, but we're heading in the right direction. I am a believer in transparency. I do a lot of work with public-private sector relationships. So to David's point, that's something the industry is getting better at. When it comes to the government, they know the government well in their space, but from a private sector's viewpoint, they don't always have those connections. So we've done things in the industry. I'm on the steering committee of the Cyber Threat Alliance. We're a founding member, as an example. We have public-private sector relationships where we can share real-time data on threats that we see in intelligence, and it's up to the government to form their response to that. I think it's traditionally between private and public sector, it's been a one-way street, and we can feed info to the public sector. We don't always get feedback coming back in. So that's a little soft, to use your words, but that's getting better. We're starting to get some of that bidirectional feedback. I think that we need to start enforcing this more, right? When it comes to these, having visibility on these breaches. The more people, it's not a matter of if, but when, unfortunately, a lot of times. There's a lot of volume out there, a lot of threat, a lot of knocking on the doors of organizations from attackers. So I think it needs to become a normal practice to be transparent and make these more commonplace when it comes to reporting. We'll just do a better job in the industry. The whole idea is cyber criminals have a business model of their own. We have to disrupt that model. We have to make it more expensive for them to operate. And if we show that we can work collectively together, public and private sector, and transparently, it's going to have a bigger impact, a costly impact on them.
Yeah, but David, are we still in this era where businesses consider a breach to be an admission of weakness?
Well, some businesses probably just see it as a cost of business. This is going to happen. We just have to accept it, and that's why there's been the big growth in cyber insurance. Although what I've never understood is how many hits you can have on your cyber insurance before your premiums become absolutely astronomical. It's going to be a combination, as Derek was just saying, of everybody, government, business, right across, provincial, municipal, and all the rest of it, actually sort of working together better and really getting a full grasp of what this actually is. I don't think people have really grasped yet that cyber, or just the IT world that we live in, is now a fact of life. I mean, we're living it right now as we communicate through this. This is just the way it's going to be from now on, and it has been for quite a long time. And in the way that we all understand certain principles about you just don't walk straight out into the road without having a good look around before you cross, we're going to have to become, as part of fact of life, just understanding cyber and the threat that can come from using these technologies as a general fact of life for everyone.
Yeah. Paul, is that going to lead, do you think, to further legal changes, further legislative changes as we go on, now that we are in this era?
Yeah, I think obviously the privacy laws are currently under review, and we expect them to be in a sense taken up a notch in the not too near future. And the other aspect to it is most of the privacy laws in Canada are based on really an ombudsman person model. So there's a person who investigates the power to make recommendations, but there's no real consequences if you don't follow those laws. Actually, an exception to that is the privacy breach reporting. When that amendment was made, there are now fines that can be levied if companies do not report breaches. So that's something to bear in mind. But for the most part, it's an ombudsperson model, and so they're looking to really, introduce higher protections into the laws and then attach actual consequences in the form of penalties for breaching them. So that's certainly something that's coming down, coming our way in the. I won't say rapidly because these things tend to move quite slowly, but maybe in the near future. There's no real sort of national sort of cybersecurity law, if you can put it that way, right? There's really, but there is obviously liability concerns for companies in the form of being sued and class actions and things of that sort. I think the federal government has been looking at sort of a national sort of cybersecurity guidelines or program, whatever the case may be, but those I wouldn't expect those to ultimately take the form of law per se. So.
Yeah, as a former ombud, I can tell you that largely the power was moral suasion, and moral suasion isn't going to get you terribly far in this climate, I would imagine. I would get all three of you to talk about this. Are we requiring something, though, broader than national law, but something in the way of a much more serious international covenant here? Derek, why don't you start there?
Yeah, good news is we're already working on this. So I'm on a task force with the World Economic Forum. It's called the C4C, Center for Cybersecurity, Partnership on Cybercrime. It's bringing public, private sector, law enforcement, prosecution together. It's brand new. I'm not sure if that is the international covenant, but we always say cybercrime has no borders. From a legal perspective, when it comes to disrupting that model, actually prosecuting, it's hard to do attribution. It's hard to get access to data transparently. There's a whole bunch of mechanisms there, but it definitely, of course, extends beyond just the scope of Canada.
Yeah, David.
We've already got some of these worldwide provisions already. One of them being the European Union's GDPR. Back in 2018, when I was doing all my thought leadership stuff and going to conferences and talking to clients, I was trying to get people to realize about the Digital Privacy Act changes to PIPEDA. But in Canada, everybody was terrified of GDPR. We're more worried about somebody else's legislation than our own. And quite rightly so, because in GDPR, if you find a breach, you've got 72 hours in which to report it to a European Union Data Commissioner, or you'll get fined up to potentially 4% of your annual turnover.
Wow.
I'm not aware of any fines coming from the DPA in Canada at this point. And in our law, it says you have to report the breach as soon as feasible, with the only word missing there being the word please.
Paul?
I agree. I think, as I said, the current Privacy Commission in Canada is on a bit of a beat or a path, beating the drums to essentially convert what is this ombudsman type model into more of a commissioner sort of European style data protection authority model. That would actually be quite a big shift in terms of how things have traditionally been handled in Canada, but that is something that we could see, like I say, perhaps not rapidly, but it is something that we could see in the next couple of years if that approach receives traction, with the government.
Yeah, you have to think that as businesses restructure themselves with much more work remotely, that there is even just an economic opportunity there to shift some of the spending that's in these office towers that we now have into kind of a protection of the company remotely in that way. I want to conclude our conversation, though, with some consumer advice, because a lot of people who will be watching us aren't necessarily the decision makers in their businesses, but they're concerned about what the amount of work that's being done from home, school work, family stuff that's being done. A lot of it being done, of course, across things like Zoom and Skype and Microsoft Teams and so on, but a lot of it also just basically across networks that are not all that secure with terms of internet providers. Help me understand, a couple of really smart consumer tips here before we let go. And Derek, I'll start with you.
Sure. So
Always be on guard. We talked about the training and education. It comes down to this sense of security. It's not just the targeted attacks, right? We talk about the COVID lures as an example. That's definitely a problem. But also, you know, as these devices now are sitting on home networks, definitely think about things like segmenting those devices. Obviously, the basics we talk about when it comes to rogue Wi-Fi access points, doing any transactions only in secure environments, knowing that you're having that sense of security, thinking about that sense of security. We're coming up on the e-commerce season now, and we actually quite frankly have been for the last month or so with everyone working from home. We're seeing a huge drive up in volume to e-commerce sites. Those are all going to be targets of compromise, you know, endpoints. If you're in the physical world walking into a shop and holding your wallet open with cash in hand, most people would think twice about doing that. But when they're on these e-commerce sites, they're not thinking like that. So we need to change that mentality. Think about it. Also, just basic things, multi-factor authentication we talk about, one-time passwords are dead, of course, VPN usage, and also I'm trying to segment, again, your device from being on the same network as those other devices that are prone, like I said, those IoT devices. Those are the top attacks that we see today.
Yeah, I don't want to sound like the cranky guy that's always complaining about cost and all of this, but you do have to do some personal investment in all of this, don't you?
Yeah, and time, right? We talk about cost and time.
Yeah.
Frankly, I think it's a good opportunity. You're talking about budget allocation. Look at all the travel budgets that have gone down organizations too. And people now sitting at home, they have the time to actually educate, I think, more on this. It is a investment.
There's no longer any $2,000 cups of coffee to go across the country. David, why don't you pick up?
A couple of simple things, following up from what Derek said. If you don't know what the password is for your router, go and find out what it is and change it right now, and change it to something complicated, all right? Something nice and complicated. In fact, all your IoT devices in the house, go and find out what the password is. And if you don't know, find out what it is. And you ready? Change it right now, because it's probably a default password that is well known on the dark web, and you can get it hacked. As simple as that. If you are definitely working at home for a long time, and looks like that's the case for all of us, it's why don't you get 2 routers, one for the family and all the rest of it, and one for your business, and keep them separate. I'm going to say, I'm sure all our families have practiced safe cybersecurity on the internet. In fact, we were just discussing about an incident with one of my members of my family just before we came on. But they'll make mistakes because they're not living in the world you live in. Why don't you just remove that risk by going and getting yourself your own separate router? And last but by no means least, don't click on that link.
Yeah, don't click on that link is for sure. Paul?
Yeah, I think I just to sort of build on what Derek and David is talking about. I think it's about sort of pick up on a comment that David made earlier. It's really about working cybersecurity into your mindset as an individual, because a lot of people, particularly people who sort of grew up in the internet age, they don't necessarily think about their online activity or things like that as being something that brings risk or danger with it, because it's just the way they're used to doing things. So now I think people have to sort of shift their mindset a bit to actually sort of build in awareness of the potential threats that are out there. Be aware of passwords, changing passwords, not clicking on links, things of that sort. Just sort of shift from being a sort of a trusting sort of mindset to how people operate online to more of a sort of a cyber secure mindset.
Mm.
And to the router comment too, for the consumer grade routers are, I talked about those top attacks. They're the #1 attacks we're seeing too. So the vulnerabilities, if there's, again, we talk about this for decades, but patches, updates, if they're available, do it. Yeah.
Mm. Well, okay, we're going to break off there so I can go and reset some passwords. But Derek, David, Paul, it's been a great conversation. Thanks a lot for your help today.
Yes, that was great.
You've been watching BIV Today. I'm Kirk LaPointe, publisher and editor-in-chief. We'll see you again.